Hello, I'm pleased to bring you the third part of the Seacoast Transportation Corridor Vulnerability Assessment overview. And in this section, we're going to be talking about the various adaptation and resilience options and the process by which we're looking at these. And this is led by myself and Jennifer Jacobs at UNH. So the general process that we're following is that we're taking the output from the travel demand model that Dave went through and looking at those 25 initial sites and identifying various site characteristics, and then also looking at possible adaptation alternatives from that initial assessment point of view. And then grouping these sites with similar characteristics and similar adaptation alternatives with the intent that we want to cover a range of different situations and allow the process or the outcomes of this particular project to be applicable to other locations. So as of right now, we're in the process of refining these to 10 to 12 sites to examine further based on those initial steps that we've conducted. And then once we do that, we'll be looking at more specifically alternatives for each of those sites, including consideration of different environmental factors and following the coastal flood risk guidance that Kirsten just went through. And then finally, we're looking at selection of a few sites for a more detailed analysis. So some of the site characteristics we're looking at is the type of impact at each site due to sea level rise. So this can include things like washout from flowing water, simple inundation, and then saturation of the base layers for the different roadways. Features that we're looking at are presence of utilities, curbs, sidewalks, various access points along the way, as well as the presence of culverts and bridges. Also looking at if the roadway is built on an embankment and proximity to marshland or other sensitive environmental areas. And then also considering the potential for using either natural or nature-based solutions in the various locations. And then evaluating different adaptation alternatives, which may be things like raising the roadway, reconstructing, or retreat. We'll talk about those more specifically. So the example sites that I'm going to be going through are the same two that Kirsten went through in illustrating the flood risk guidance. So we're looking at Cusack Road and High Street that come into North Beach and Hampton. So looking at each of these roadways a little bit more detail, some pictures. This is showing Cusack Road looking from the intersection of Route 1 down the roadway segment. Okay. Partway through, you can see in the middle of the segment, there's the marshland on either side. And then finally, a view from the end of the segment looking down towards Route 1. Similar views for High Street. Again, here's the intersection looking down the segment towards the west, midway down the segment, and then looking back east at the end of the segment towards the beach and Route 1. So the type of impacts at both sites are similar. Okay, neither site really is at significant risk of washout from moving water, mostly because of the orientation of the roadways with respect to the coastline. Water flowing would be flowing down the roadway and not necessarily across the roadway where you get a lot of the washout action happening. Inundation, okay, due to flooding is definitely potential at both sites, okay, which would close the roadway to through traffic and potentially restrict access to some of the residents and businesses along those segments. And then also both sites are subject to rising groundwater tables due to sea level rise. So with those rising groundwater tables, we'll see increased moisture levels underneath the pavement, which will decrease both the subgrade and the base layer strength, which will decrease the overall load carrying capacity of the roadway. Meaning that essentially with the same level of traffic, we'll be seeing increased damage and maintenance costs along those segments over their lifetime. So in terms of the features for both roadways, both are crossing marshland, have culverts and utilities. Cusack Road has very narrow unpaved shoulders, as you saw in the pictures, whereas High Street does have a paved shoulder, relatively significant paved shoulder on one side and some paved shoulder on the other side. Cusack Road has some sidewalk, but really just limited to a short segment right near the intersection of Route 1, whereas High Street has continuous sidewalk along the north side of the roadway the entire length. Cusack Road, there's few access points, and those are limited really on the east side and the west side of the segment, whereas High Street has access points, driveways along the entire segment. Also, High Street is a primary route, so has increased traffic volumes and probably loads as compared to Cusack Road. In terms of the different adaptation alternatives, again, following the guidance, the Step 7 guidance that Kirsten mentioned, for Cusack Road, there is an option for no action, especially in the short term. And again, this would be need to be investigated a little bit further depending upon the extent of the flooding and how long the inundation lasts. In terms of avoidance, this would really be no further development along the segment, which is likely the case as it is with the marshland there. In terms of accommodation, different alternatives in terms of raising the road or reconstructing with different materials could be considered. With raising the road, because of the limited shoulder width, would require encroachment into the marsh. So not necessarily the best alternative from an environmental standpoint. And then reconstruction could be a viable alternative looking at different materials to get you the same structural capacity without having to raise the profile or the elevation of the roadway surface. In terms of resisting, could look at berms along the affected area. There might be questionable effectiveness in terms of where the water actually moves, and may potentially look at marsh encroachment here, but this is a possibility for looking at the application of natural or nature-based solutions. And then in terms of relocation, this location is a possibility for some managed retreat and as a long-term solution, because there are limited access points, or really the only businesses or residences are on the ends of the segment. And so retreating from this particular roadway would not create a lot of issues with access to existing structures. In terms of High Street adaptation alternatives, again, similar, no action could be investigated for the short term, and avoidance in terms of no further development. In terms of accommodation, again, a little bit different here, where they're raising the roadway is more of a possibility because we've got those extended shoulder areas, reconstructing with different materials, and actually a combination of the two might be a possible alternative and effective alternative, looking at it in more detail. In terms of resisting, any kind of berms, again, natural nature-based solutions become more complicated with the adjacent properties along the length on the north side of the roadway. And then in terms of relocation or managed retreat of this section, it's not really a viable solution unless a larger retreat is planned for the area. So with that, we'll be looking at some of these adaptation alternatives in more detail, and I thank you for your attention and look forward to any questions folks might have.